everybody. On behalf of the PHRN, I'd like to welcome you to the Linkage Luminaries webinar series for 2022. My name's Felicity Flack and I'm the Manager of Policy and Client Services at PHRN. Today, I'm talking to you from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all of the lands we're meeting on today and paying my respects to elders past and present. First of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions for today's speaker, please type them in the Q&A box, and you can do this anytime during the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and we will email you as soon as it's available on the PHRN YouTube channel. So to today's speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Melissa Green from the University of New South Wales, who's the lead investigator on the New South Wales Child Development Study. Linked data is a valuable tool for longitudinal cohort studies, so I'm really interested to hear more about how she's been using linked data in her studies. Over to you, Melissa.
Thanks very much. I'll just get my screen to share. Brilliant. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. As you mentioned, I am the lead investigator of the New South Wales Child Development Study, having taken over from Professor Vaughan Carr, who initiated that study more than 10 years ago now. So we're in a very good place to be examining the data for this cohort of children. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work we've done to try to detect risk for mental illness in childhood, given that we are a group that emerged out of a school of psychiatry and initiated this study with this kind of work in mind to try to understand how mental disorders develop over the life course. So I'm sure most of you know somebody with a mental illness, because over half of all Australian adults will meet the criteria for a mental illness at some time in their life. And unlike chronic health conditions, physical health conditions, mental illness does disproportionately affect the young. People aged between 16 and 25 years have the highest prevalence of mental disorders in this country, and the impacts of that affect them through their life course in terms of their educational and other social outcomes. And the Australian Productivity Commission produced a report in 2020 that highlighted some guides to reform and most prominently prioritised the need for greater efforts in early prevention and intervention. The maps that are here on this image highlight the regional areas of Australia as places with very high suicide rates and where there is a lower use of mental health services. And so these really also highlight the opportunity for the use of population health data in Australia to assist to move forward with some of the recommendations made by this report. And so the New South Wales Child Development Study provides one of those opportunities of linked data from cross-sectoral agencies for a cohort of children growing up in New South Wales. And I'm just going to take a minute to describe the design of the study to you, for those of you who haven't heard of it before. You can see on this slide is a timeline which goes back to 1994. And in the middle of the timeline, you can see here 2009, which is actually the year that this study started, when the cohort of children we're following were assessed with the Australian Early Development Census. And so that was the first year that that census was rolled out nationally, and we've focused on the New South Wales cohort. So we did a first wave of linkage at that point, which was a retrospective linkage to get the data going back to birth for that child cohort, and for the parents of the children who have their births registered in New South Wales. We get the parent data, which goes as far back as 1994 for the justice records for that cohort. Now, we were aiming to follow this child cohort through to adolescence and adulthood, and we're doing that through a series of record linkages that occur every 5 years or so, coinciding with funding and the stage of development that the children have reached. And so our second wave of linkage was conducted in 2016, and it incorporated a second cross-sectional assessment that was a self-report assessment called the Middle Childhood Survey. And we initiated that assessment, which was conducted in collaboration with schools in New South Wales. We were able to gain data for around 27,000 children, was around a third of the original population. But nevertheless, our linkages continue for the entire population of children, whether they completed the early development census, the middle childhood survey, or both. And that leaves us with a cohort that you can see at the bottom there of 91,635 children that we're now going to follow for as long as possible into adulthood. The two papers that provide information about the cohort profile are just shown here for you in case you're interested to read about them. The first paper was published in the BMJ Open in 2016, led by Vaughan Carr. So it deals with the data linkage up to age 5 years or school entry when the children completed the AEDC. And the second paper there that you can see is providing information about the second wave of linkage up to age 13 years. We are currently in the throes of cleaning data for our third wave of linkage. And so we're all very excited that our children have now reached late adolescence. They're 18 years old, and we'll start showing some more crystallized signs of mental illness and other adverse and hopefully some good outcomes that we can then track back in terms of how these things have developed over the life course. So to start the presentation today, there are 3 parts, and this is the first part where we asked with our first wave of linkage data whether we could determine population risk for mental illness at school entry using the AEDC. So we were looking for groups of individuals with particular patterns on the AEDC. If you're unfamiliar with the AEDC, it's a population measure of early developmental competency on 5 core domains that are shown here. The way that the AEDC is scored is that if a child scores in the lowest 10th percentile of the national distribution, they're deemed developmentally vulnerable on that particular domain. Underneath the 5 domains, there are 16 subdomains of the AEDC. And I'm showing you these because this was the level of data that we used to try to understand patterns of vulnerability. So you can see under each of the 5 domains, there are several items, except for the communication domain, which only has one item. But those are the 16 items that we used to conduct a latent class analysis on our population of children in New South Wales. So here were the results from that latent class analysis. On the x-axis here are these 16 subdomains of the AEDC, and on the y-axis you have the response probability of being vulnerable on any of those or every one of those domains. And I'll walk you through the 4 classes that you can see here in this diagram. The first class thankfully represents 77% of the population. It's the one in black at the bottom, where these children are showing virtually no risk, no vulnerability on any of the AEDC subdomains. Second, there's a group that's represented in green. We've called this the mild generalized risk class. It represents around 11%, 11.5% of the population. And these children are showing obviously very mild probability of vulnerability on each of those 16 subdomains. With a little kick you can see at the basic numeracy and communication general knowledge end, and that will become the prominence of that will come up later when we look at some of the outcomes for these children. In blue, there's a class representing around 7% of the population. We've called this class the misconduct risk class because they predominantly have vulnerability in behavioural and emotional domains, or social and emotional domains, where they are showing problems with responsibility and respect in the classroom. They're showing aggressive behaviour, hyperactive and inattentive behaviour, and that's really the only vulnerabilities they're showing. Then finally, there's a class represented in red, and it's called the pervasive risk class for obvious reasons. These children are showing a high probability of vulnerability across all of the subdomains of the AEDC. And that's a group that we were particularly interested to follow over time to determine whether they're at higher risk for mental illness and other adverse outcomes. So I'm going to show you a couple of studies now to do with those profiles, those latent profiles of AEDC vulnerability. This was the first paper that introduced the profiles. And the first thing that we were able to do, obviously we had data only up to age 5 at this point. So we looked at the types of things that were evident in the data from birth through to school entry to determine what was associated with membership in each of these classes. And the first and most obvious thing that you'll notice from this slide is that being a male child is the strongest risk factor for being a member of the pervasive and the misconduct risk class. But following closely behind as a risk factor is child maltreatment. And I want to point out that in this stage of our linkage, we were only provided with substantiated child protection reports, as well as children who had been placed in out-of-home care. So these children are not the ones just, getting lower level reports that don't meet threshold for risk of harm. These children have had a substantiated report of maltreatment, and their likelihood of being a member of this pervasive risk or misconduct risk or even the mild generalized risk class is around 2 times as likely as children who had not been subjected to child maltreatment. I'm not going to go through the rest of the list here, but you can see that there are other very obvious risk factors: having parents with mental illness or offending histories, being at socioeconomic disadvantage, and a number of perinatal risk factors that all have small but significant odds and associations with membership in each of these risk classes. The next thing we did when we had data up to age 13 for this cohort was to examine whether these risk profiles of the AEDC were associated with later mental illness in childhood. And this is the paper if you'd like to see it. So firstly, this graph is showing you the percent of children in each of the risk groups who were treated in a hospital or ambulatory setting for a mental disorder by the time they were aged 13 years. And it's very clear from this graph that already 10% of the children in the pervasive risk class have been diagnosed with a mental disorder within these health records, versus 3.9% of the children who were in the no risk class when they entered school. So these data come from our second linkage, as I mentioned, where we've got around 5% of the child cohort being represented in this health service data. And it's important to note that these types of mental illness are obviously at the very severe end if a child is being treated in a hospital or ambulatory setting. Anyone receiving care by a GP or a lower level or private psychiatrist won't be represented here. When we look at the odds of particular diagnoses among children that have been placed in these risk classes, we can see clearly here that children in the pervasive or misconduct risk class are at very high odds or have very high likelihood of being diagnosed with a hyperkinetic disorder such as ADHD or with a developmental disorder such as autism. Their odds of conduct disorder, self-harm, stress reactions, emotional disorders are also at least twice as likely than the children who are in the no risk class. Whereas the mild generalized risk group are really only showing some propensity toward being diagnosed with an ADHD type illness or a developmental disorder, but are less, less prominent in the other types of mental disorders. But obviously, these risk profiles aren't the only thing contributing. And you can see that at the top slide of this slide says that we've adjusted for several things in these analyses. And I actually wanted to show you the odds ratios associated with those covariates, because again, it's very stark that the child protection contacts, and this time it's not limited to substantiated child protection reports. This is any child protection contact at all. Children known to child protection services have extremely high odds of being diagnosed with a number of mental disorders by the time they're 13. Obviously, having a parent with a mental illness provides some genetic as well as socially learned risk for mental illness. And so that's also featuring prominently across the board here in terms of risk for all of the mental disorders. And what I also wanted to point out, though, clearly was that we know very well that the developmental path to adult mental disorder often involves early contact with the justice system and poor school performance. And so I want to just run you briefly through a couple of other studies where the outcomes we looked at were to do with justice and school outcomes in relation to these AEDC risk profiles. So the first one was a paper that was published in JAMA Network Open. It's led by Kimberly Dean, one of the investigators on the project. And this paper shows a very high incidence of police contact, particularly as a person of interest, rather than a victim or a witness, among children in the pervasive misconduct and mild generalized risk group. So I'm not going to labour this paper. There's a lot more detail in the paper if you wanted to go and look at it, but just wanted to briefly point out that these risk profiles at school entry are also useful for understanding risk for other types of social adversities, like being in contact with the police very early and potentially with other justice outcomes that will follow up as these children develop. In terms of school outcomes, we've looked at NAPLAN assessments and also suspensions. And I'll start briefly with the NAPLAN assessments. This graph is showing you the percentage of children in each of the risk groups that have failed to meet the national minimum standard in both grades 3 and 5 for reading and numeracy. So reading is the bold and numeracy, the checkered bars, but there's not much difference in it. That the pervasive risk group, you can see nearly 20% of children are showing this pervasive NAPLAN poor performance. And when we look at the odds ratios in a logistic regression, we can see that this is borne out here very clearly with very large effects present for the pervasive risk group and actually the mild generalized risk group, which, as I mentioned when I showed you the original graph, they were already showing some problems with numeracy and communication as one of the very few vulnerabilities that was in that profile. And so it's bearing out here that in later years, that mild generalized risk group are showing very strong likelihood of persistent underachievement in school. And this paper is in preparation at the moment, being led by Kristen Lawrence, another one of the senior members of our team. The other work that Kristen's looked at is out of school suspensions. And similarly here, I'm just showing you the percentage of children in each risk class who have been suspended either on a single occasion or on multiple occasions. And you can see that it's this time the misconduct and the pervasive risk groups where the likelihood of suspension is very prominent. Again, in the logistic regression models, there are very large effects evident for the association between being a member of those pervasive or misconduct risk groups and suspension in school between grades 3 and 6. The mild generalized risk group are also showing some evidence of their higher likelihood of being suspended as well. So finally, on this set of data, a very recent publication from a PhD student in our group and the manager of our study, Felicity Harris, has mapped the percentage of children in each region, LGA region of the state, who are showing this misconduct or pervasive risk profile. And we've done that in the hope that we can help to inform the place-based service provision of mental health services. We know that the New South Wales Health Department are already using this to inform their own delivery of a program called the Got It program, which is focused on children with conduct disorder or emerging conduct disorder. And that some of our other work in mapping the regional distribution of psychopathology with our middle childhood survey is helping that department also to place nurses in schools depending on the regional need. Okay, so I'm going to move to part 2 of the presentation where we focus on the mental health of children known to child protection services. And the reason for doing that should be obvious from the work I just showed you, where child protection emerges as one of the most significant predictors of both membership in that child protection, membership in the early childhood risk classes, and also in relation to mental disorder diagnoses in the children by the age of 13. And so in our Wave 2 data, 24% of the child cohort had at least one record of child protection contact by the age of 13 years. And when we placed those children into a hierarchy according to the highest level of child protection response that they had received, we see that 2.4% of the population have ever been placed in out-of-home care by age 13. 3.6% of the population have a highest level of child protection service where they've received a substantiated ROSH report or risk of significant harm report for those not in New South Wales. The majority of the group have a non-substantiated ROSH report as their highest level of service. And that's a mixture of children whose reports have been followed up and not substantiated, but also whose reports have met that threshold for being followed up, but there may not be the resources available to follow up every ROSH report. So that 14% of children, even though their reports are not substantiated, some of them may still be at risk of harm. And then finally, there's a smaller group of 3.5% who have had a non-ROSH report. So I'm going to show you a couple of studies focused on these children. The first one was published in the Medical Journal of Australia in 2019, where we simply looked at the association between being known to child protection services prior to school entry and being diagnosed with a mental disorder in those years after school entry between the ages 6 and 13 or 14 years. So there were a total of 74,462 children included in this particular analysis, of whom 18.5% were known to child protection services and 4.2% had been diagnosed with a mental disorder by the time the data ended. What we saw here very clearly was that 9.8% of the children known to child protection services had a record of mental disorder diagnoses by age 13 or 14, versus only 2.9% of the children who had had no contact with child protection. Only 2.9% had a mental disorder diagnoses. And of those children known to child protection services, they were more than 4 times as likely to engage in self-harm or be diagnosed with a hyperkinetic or conduct disorder. They were more than 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with an emotion disorder or stress reaction, and more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with a developmental disorder. Sorry, there we go. When we break it down and look at the association between the particular level of child protection response and being diagnosed with any kind of mental illness to start with, these are unadjusted odds ratios, so they are not accounting for other things that clearly would have a contribution to being diagnosed with a mental illness. But nevertheless, they are showing that the children who have been placed in out-of-home care by the age of 13 are at least 8 times as likely as children without a child protection response to be diagnosed with any kind of mental illness. There does need to be, you need to acknowledge that these children have a pathway of health service, mandatory health checks as soon as they're placed in out-of-home care. So it's highly likely that they're being picked up with mental illness because they're being, they've got their contact with the health service is mandated. But this graph still shows you that children who have been subjected to a substantiated ROSH report or an unsubstantiated ROSH report, or even the non-ROSH report, are at a higher likelihood of being diagnosed with any mental illness by the time they're 13 years of age. And if we look at the specific diagnoses that these children are being diagnosed with in the health records, this time we are adjusting for things like the child's sex, the socioeconomic disadvantage, parental mental disorder, and perinatal complications. You can see that the odds of being diagnosed with developmental disorders, conduct disorders, hyperkinetic disorders, nearly all of them, is over 5 times as likely for the children in out-of-home care compared to children without a child protection report. But again, that all of the other children who have contact with child protection, regardless of whether their reports are substantiated or not, are at higher risk of all of these types of mental disorders than other children in the population without that contact with child protection. So I mentioned earlier that these results that are coming out of our health data are limited to mental disorders that reach a certain threshold that require care in those settings. But we also have data from our middle childhood survey that provides an opportunity for the children to self-report their own mental health and well-being. And so I want to just talk you through this paper that looked at the self-reported mental health of children known to child protection services. This one was led by Kirsty O'Hare, a postdoctoral research fellow working with our team. This study was limited to 26,960 children who had all the available data that we needed within the middle childhood survey to conduct these analyses. And just to flag again that we had around 829 schools, about 35% of the state, agree to participate in the MCS, and that crossed all school sectors. And there is a manuscript that shows the representativeness of that sample against the rest of the state. But moving to the results of this study, just focusing on the SDQ items, there are other indices of psychopathology reported in the paper. But just for the sake of brevity today, I'm showing you the results here, odds ratios for each of the types of children known to Child Protection Service. So your out-of-home care, substantiated, unsubstantiated, and non-ROSH highest level of reporting. And what you can see very clearly is that all levels of child protection reporting, so children that have been subjected to all levels, are more than twice as likely than children without the child protection reports to score in the abnormal range on the total difficulty score of the SDQ. And in particular, children in out-of-home care have very high likelihood of peer relationship problems and conduct problems, as do the children who have had substantiated ROSH reports. Again, all children, though, in child protection have these very obvious risk for mental health problems in middle childhood. And so it suggests that some of the services that are provided, particularly for children in out-of-home care at the moment, could be extended further to all children known to child protection services. This moves me to what should have been part 3 on this slide, whether we can go even further back in time and determine risk for mental health problems from information known at birth. And this was a study that was published just last year. It was led by me, but I want to pay a particular acknowledgement to Oliver Watke, the second author, who arrived as the study was in review, and he really took hold of undertaking the final set of analyses for this paper, and it couldn't have been done without him. What the paper tried to do was to establish the minimum set of exposures known at birth, if possible, to accurately predict these outcomes listed here. So AEDC, developmental vulnerability, sustained educational underachievement over the grade 3 and grade 5 NAPLAN, childhood mental disorder diagnoses, childhood maltreatment, police contact as a victim, or police contact as a person of interest. So we had those 6 outcomes, and the set of 14 individual and familial risk exposures that are listed on the left of the slide here. And we set about trying to determine whether we could get a best fitting model, and a model that accurately predicted each of those outcomes individually. And if we could, what were the minimum set of risk exposures required to actually accurately predict that particular outcome? What this slide is showing you is a lot of busy information that I don't want you to try to take in at all. I've highlighted what I want you to take in, and that is that we could not predict with very good accuracy childhood mental disorder diagnoses from that list of risk exposures at birth. But what we could predict fairly well was childhood maltreatment, that you can see just underneath, where the area under the receiver operating curve was up to about 0.84 in a full model with 14 risk factors. And you could get a very similar area under the receiving operating curve using only 10 of the covariates. We were also able to predict contact with police as a person of interest fairly well. But the idea that we had that we might be able to predict mental disorder from stuff known at the time of birth, we couldn't do. But I just want to say that these risk factors, some of them are very well known to be associated with later mental disorder. And so obviously they're probably operating via other intermediate events and adversities and interactions between gene and environment. And so this slide's just a pictorial that suggests that over time, with an increasing number of exposures and effects on the epigenetics and other biological systems, those risk factors at birth may still play a role, but aren't as useful as we'd hoped they'd be to be able to predict childhood mental disorder in that first instance. So getting ready to close up, the strengths of our study include that we are able to avoid sampling bias and recall bias for the risk factors of interest in the work that we do, and that following up this cohort into adulthood will allow us to determine dynamic changes in risk for mental illness over the life course. And so we hope to be able to keep being funded to do that. Obviously, there are some limitations, and those include that our parental data linkage is limited to those who have a birth record registered in New South Wales. The mental disorder diagnostic data has to date been limited to the most severe presentations requiring hospital treatment or ambulatory settings. We've touched on our middle childhood survey data, and we will do more with that to understand how self-reported information can be of use in understanding how children develop mental disorder over the life course. Probably most importantly though, there are many other potential contributors to the development of mental illness that can't be gleaned from linked administrative data like this. And for example, we don't know the quality of the relationships that these children have with their parents or their carers. We don't know what the family unit looks like. Are they all living together? Does the child have their own bedroom and space? And so there is a lot of information that really does require more small scale studies where you can interview people to understand other risk factors that just cannot be gleaned in administrative data. And so to summarize what I've shown you here today from our data, we've shown that children can be detected at school entry who appear to be at higher risk of later mental illness and other social and educational adversities. Being subjected to child maltreatment in early life is one of the strongest risk factors for later developmental vulnerability and mental health problems. And patterns of familial risk known at the time of birth can at least be useful to identify families who are at risk of perpetrating child maltreatment, which can in turn then lead to developmental and mental health problems. And just to put that all back into context with what I opened this presentation with, what we've got happening in Australia at the moment is a lot of expenditure on mental health focused on emerging mental disorders. For example, our Headspace scheme, which is available for children aged 12 and upwards, or 12 to 25. And while that's welcomed, obviously there are children showing signs and overt mental illness prior to that time. And so the services for mental health in Australia really must stretch back further into the earlier childhood years and provide a more streamlined service that doesn't jump from different service provision in the community that makes it very difficult to move from child to adolescent services. But those services must also be complemented with population-based preventative approaches. And that was very much explicated in the report by the Australian Productivity Commission. They recommend that we stop relying on help seekers to identify themselves, and that we instead increase supports for new parents and prioritise the social and emotional development of school children by providing programs within schools and in those very early childhood years. And so what I hope to have shown you today is that these preventative approaches can be informed by routinely collected government data. We can help to show where in the regional parts of Australia there are increased population needs for service provision and other supports. And so we hope that the work we do and that we continue to do will inform place-based prevention and the delivery of school-based social and emotional health programs across the state. I'd like to finish by acknowledging a large team of people. This is a huge effort on behalf of a lot of people over a lot of years. So the core and current team are all pictured here: Vaughan Carr, Felicity Harris, Kimberly Dean, Kristen Lawrence, Stacey Tamakis, Oliver Watkins, Kirsty O'Hare and Tyson Witten. Very grateful to all of these people and the effort that they put in. It's been a long haul for all of us. But I wanted to acknowledge the past team members listed there as well. And of course, our data custodians. There are many. I will not read through this slide. We are grateful and very thankful for the ongoing support of all these custodians. And just to be clear that the information and views that we do report in our manuscripts do not necessarily reflect the views of those custodians. If you're interested to look at the papers emerging from this study, this is our website. All of our findings can be found under this link here. All the publications are available and summarized actually, so you don't even need to read them. We give you a brief summary and a link to the source. You'll also find there some evidence to action notes that we have written with the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, because they've been very interested in our work over the last 10 years. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Melissa. I just can't turn my video on. There we go. I'm sure Nicola will work out a way to help me do that. Thank you so much. That's just the most enormous amount of work in a really important area, and you really summarized your findings beautifully. I was, I think, able to understand at least some of it.
Thank you.
Really
and it's really only about a quarter, or if that, of the output from this study. There's so much more that I didn't want to bombard with too much more information.
No, but I really do encourage everybody to go and look at those resources that Melissa's just pointed out if you're really interested. It sounds like there's an awful lot more to discover. So we're going to take questions now. So if anybody would like to ask, see a few coming in now. So pop your questions in the Q&A box, and let's start with the first one, which is, would it be useful to also intervene at the preschool and early learning stage of a child's educational journey?
Yes. Clearly, there's a gap there between being born and starting school at that place that we have shown, where there's around 10%, if you combine the pervasive risk and the misconduct risk groups, you've got around 10% of children starting school in a very vicarious place. And those years just prior, where they were hopefully receiving early childcare, could have been a time when I think there would be evidence already to be able to detect those children at risk, whether it's in their own behaviour in those school early childcare environments, or as we've shown, looking at the perinatal and antenatal time, when the families are in contact with the health system, there are clearly some markers there that suggest you could find the families that are showing vulnerability, that their child is going to end up in one of those risk groups when they start school. And besides that, there are probably universal things that could be done to provide the best start for children, regardless of those risk factors. So yes.
Yes. And just to add a question of mine to that is, do we know enough, do we have enough evidence about what those interventions could or should be between birth and starting school?
It's not the work that I do. This question bugs me a lot because I'm not the person to offer the preventative, you know, what you do about it. My work is highlighting where to offer the help. But our work with New South Wales Health has suggested that just having nursing staff available to schools, to the early childcare places, having maternal child and health services provide extra care to those people that we are suggesting have extra needs. Most of the health and other social service agencies are onto this, and they're trying to do the best they can. So it's not as if it's not happening, but it's clearly not quite reaching the children that are requiring the extra support. So there's still some work to do there. Whether we have evidence that things work, I'm not so sure. There's a lot of work in the United States showing that those types of very early childhood interventions are paying off. They're both economically viable and they're working in terms of the child outcomes. In this country, there's not as much research to definitely say this thing works and that thing doesn't, but it's an area open for much more research.
Okay, great. Okay, next question. Thank you for presenting. This work is so interesting. I wonder if you could speak to the validity of AECD risk class measure. I ask, given the measure is based on a national distribution, a relative measure, rather than some sort of absolute cut point.
Okay. There is an absolute cut point though, and it's defined by the population. So the AEDC itself has had a lot of work behind it to determine its validity and utility as a population measure. One of the things that is needing to be pointed out is that you're not supposed to take a population measure and apply it to an individual child. And that's why we always talk in groups of children, and we try to highlight that we're talking at population levels here. But in terms of the validity of the measure, I wouldn't question it. Our particular measure uses subdomains, as I explained, and they've been subjected to just as much scrutiny as the domains in terms of determining their validity in measuring what they claim to measure. So I wouldn't be concerned about that, nor the use of the population distribution, really.
Okay. All right. The next question is about potential correlations between climate change issues and mental health. For example, I'm aware of research that found a very high correlation between extended drought in rural Australia and increased risk of suicide in recent years. Yeah. Is the study beginning to incorporate such environmental factors in the analysis?
We haven't as yet, but it's a very good point, and we do intend to. Clearly, we've got COVID-19 happening as well, and there's a few existential threats facing the human race at the moment that's impacting all of us, actually. And I think that in time, we will be able to see the effects of those things. What this questioner has pointed out, though, is an important aspect of the study of mental illness in rural areas. And so in the future, we will take that on board in terms of trying to understand the environmental impact on what we're seeing in our data.
So while you're talking about the future of the study, do you want to just give us a little bit of an idea about where you're heading from here?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, there's actually a lot more work on several other themes to do with criminology, to do with the educational outcomes and child protection. We've just reached the stage, as I also mentioned, of having data up to age 18 years for the cohort. And so much of the work that we've done in the original years can now be examined in relation to those later outcomes. And so one of the things I haven't spoken about in today's presentation is that we determined a measure of resilience among children in their early and middle childhood years. And we are going to be very interested to follow the children who they were known to child protection services. So they had something to kind of bounce back from. And there's a group of them who are showing emergent resilience over time, and a group that just showed sustained resilience. They're doing very well regardless. But it will be really interesting to see whether they maintain that resilience into the later adolescent years. And it will depend, of course, on intervening events that happen for those children over the life course. So that's one thing that we're really interested to look at. But ultimately, we're a group of people interested in mental illness. And so the age at which mental illness really starts to emerge is now in our cohort, from 18 and onwards. So we really want to be able to follow the cohort at least to age 30 and possibly further if we can maintain funding and stamina to keep going.
Certainly need stamina. Yes. And just a question about your data needs going forward, because PHRN as a data infrastructure provider are interested in what researchers' needs are going forward. You've obviously had access to an extensive range of linked data, and there are, as you mentioned, limitations to what administrative data can provide. But do you have a sort of wish list of some data that you would like to be able to access?
Yes. Your question earlier around, do we know whether these services and supports work? Well, it'd be really good if the data collections kept a good record of who was receiving which services at what point in time. Obviously, some of that's there, our health service and stuff, but there are, I mean, it's a difficult ask because a lot of services are provided by non-government organisations. You can't keep track of what's happening for everyone, but it's a common problem when we are meeting with the agencies in our state who ask the exact question you did. Do you know if this works if we provide it at this age? No, we don't, and we can't answer that at the moment with the type of data being collected. But the other thing that I would say to that question is it would be really great if proper data dictionaries were kept by each agency. I mean, they're pretty good, but at times they're sparing. We get some data that we don't know what it is, don't know how it's been coded. So that's one thing that we, it just takes time. It takes everybody's time up to go back and forth to try to understand what this thing actually is. But yeah, that'd be my two top things on the wish list.
Okay. Noted. Next question. Could you comment on how strong the New South Wales mental health response has been around trauma-informed models of mental health care?
I don't think I can comment on that. I'm not part of the health service. Okay. Sorry.
That's all right.
So I'm aware that there is movement to ensure that there is a trauma-informed response, as there is in DCJ. It's a difficult thing, but no, I couldn't say whether it's been good enough. Yeah.
Okay. And I think we might finish with this question. Do you think there are opportunities for a more structured connection between researchers and government agencies to support translation of your really important research findings?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And the answer is yes. So it's already happening. You can see it, that there's definitely a movement that the government understands academics have this expertise that they would otherwise usually contract out to people that charge a lot more than we do. And so I think that would be an excellent outcome from work like this, to both inform how that structure could work and that each party gets to meet their own needs out of doing this work. But that the work we do needs to translate quickly across to what governments are doing. So to improve that structure and infrastructure for that to happen would be amazing. yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. And I'll say thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And from all the questions, it sounds like the audience has really found it fascinating as well. So thank you once again, Melissa. And I'm just going to share my screen just to finish off to remind everybody that our next Linkage Luminaries webinar is on the 18th of May, and it's in fact somebody else from UNSW, which is Professor Louisa Jorm. So we look forward to hearing from Louisa next month. So I'll say goodbye to Melissa and thank you to everybody for attending today. I hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.